Hello, Zer0 Books readers and viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this video, I'm going to answer the question, is the cancel culture really Marxist? Let's start with Mark Fisher, author of our bestseller, Capitalist Realism. It's likely that Mark Fisher, were he alive today, would object to how often his 2014 essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle, is cited, but unfortunately, we can never determine in advance what our legacy will be. In his essay, Fisher wrote about Russell Brand's nearly forgotten appearance on Newsnight in late 2013. Specifically, he wrote that Brand's victory over Jeremy Paxman helped Fisher overcome a bout of depression.
Do you see any hope?
Remember that? Yeah, totally. There's going to be a revolution. It's totally going to happen. I think not only I ain't got a flicker of doubt. This is the end.
According to Fisher, online leftist moralists misinterpreted Brand, thinking he was claiming that he would be the one to lead the revolution. For these moralistic lefties, everything boiled down to personal behavior. Everyone was to be judged based on their attitudes. For Fisher, this represented a massive failure for the left, as it turned people away from a common struggle to change the power structures that oppress the working class. The working class that he, ironically, mainly understood along cultural or identitarian lines. And yet, Fisher was pointing in the right direction when he wrote at the end of the essay, quote, "The goal is not to be an activist or a leftist, but to aid the working class to activate and transform itself." But before we can activate and transform or abolish the working class, we'll have to move beyond this sort of critique of the cancel culture. Do you enjoy these videos? If so, you should click on that subscribe button, click the bell, and most of all, you should support us on Patreon. We've recently introduced 2 new patron-only podcasts. That is Television in Theory, or TV in Theory, and Cinema and Communism. Here's the part where I answer the question posed at the start of the video. The part where I answer the question, is cancel culture Marxist? Well, yes. That is, if we're asking whether some of the ideological assumptions that supported the Cultural Revolution in China and the Soviet Union are also present on Twitter and other social media platforms, well, then the answer is yes. In an essay entitled Mao Zedong's Impact on Cultural Politics in the West, Professor Andrew Ross argued that after their victory over Chiang Kai-shek in 1949, after the nationalization of capital in the 50s, Mao insisted that economic and political change was not enough. The remnants of the old system lived on in the minds of various people. The former capitalists, the old landlords, property-owning peasants, and most dangerously, certain members of the party bureaucracy itself, held on to the old reactionary ideas and worldviews. This meant that the next phase in the socialist revolution would best be characterized as a battle of ideas. The struggle would be over whose notions would influence the youth and the succeeding generations. Key to this cultural turn was Mao's rejection of the economism or determinism that had gripped the Soviet Union. While both Mao and Stalin moved between economism and voluntarism as circumstances dictated, and when Mao rejected Stalin's economism, it was as much about exerting political independence for China as it was about a principled or theoretical difference. When we do consider this in the context of a theoretical dispute, Mao was not completely unjustified. Stalin's version of economism centered on industrialization and technological innovation as a primary objective for the Soviet Union. Rather than concerning itself with the abolition of class, that is, the overcoming of what Marxists would call the social relations that are at the center of capitalist production, Stalin turned his policies towards developing what Marxists would call the forces of production. Building new factories, producing more steel, laying more wire for electrification. This was what would lead to socialism. Of course, economic and cultural revolutionary aims informed both Chinese and Soviet policies. But in the Soviet Union, most of the efforts for cultural transformation occurred before World War II and served very different pragmatic needs. A full exploration and comparison of the Chinese and Russian cultural revolutions is something I'll take up in future podcasts and videos. What we should understand now is that when Mao's cultural churn came to America, it, again, took on an entirely different character. The American version of Maoist thought was spread by the New Left and by various subcultures. In China, the Cultural Revolution was taken up in the context of a would-be socialist revolution. It was an attempt to overcome what we might continue to think of as the crisis in Marxism, a crisis that can be traced back to the 1890s and the early 20th century. Back to the debates between Bernstein and Luxemburg about Bernstein's thoroughly bourgeois economism. It was an attempt to overcome the split between determinism and voluntarism that arose due to the perceived failure of Marxist theory after the Long Depression failed to motivate a proletariat revolution. But in America, the Cultural Revolution was taken up, as Andrew Ross explains in his essay, because the ideas of Mao's Cultural Revolution were largely already in accord with critiques of Fordism and with Western Marxism as it was developed by the Frankfurt School. Ross wrote, "The practice of self-criticism, for example, was taken up by liberals born into white skin privilege, and it rapidly spread to other kinds of privilege related to class, gender, and sexuality. It became almost obligatory for speakers on certain political topics to publicly acknowledge or apologize for any such privilege that might have shaped their opinions. In time, self-criticism also became an important confessional ritual within the culture of popular therapy and self-help, demonstrating how effectively its resonant spirit has passed into the mainstream." And yet, according to Ross, the American Maoists themselves often consider themselves to be in opposition to the movements that were most receptive to self-criticism and consciousness-raising. As these Maoists, holding with a more orthodox Marxist workerism, tried to emulate an American working class, the Maoists took to be socially conservative. What all of this points out is that unresolved problems within the struggle for socialism replicate themselves, even as they change. And today, those who are most attached to the aim of transforming the culture no longer have the creation of a socialist society in mind at all. I'll return to the question of cultural revolution or the problem of voluntarism in the next Critical Cuts video. But for now, I want to close out this video by answering a different question than the one we posed at the outset. Namely, I want to ask not whether or not cancel culture is broadly Marxist, but rather whether Marx was a free speech advocate. The answer to this question is again, yes. Not only did Marx struggle against state censorship throughout his life, not only did he see the struggle for a free press as central to the struggle for socialism, but he more generally considered liberal or bourgeois values to be the values socialism would realize. For example, in 1841, when the Prussian government's newspaper published columns advocating for state censorship, Marx responded passionately. For instance, Marx claimed that the Assembly's stipulation that the enjoyment of the right to assembly and to free speech could be limited by considerations of the equal rights of others and by considerations of public safety meant to Marx that the Assembly had canceled the right to free speech altogether. In an essay entitled Karl Marx's Theory of Free Speech, Professor Eric Hines from Queen Mary University of London wrote, "In casting doubt on liberal rights, Marx does not bury free speech. He liberates it. What we need is not something weaker than a free speech right, but something stronger. And despite witnessing slavery, exploitation, child labor, and women's oppression, Marx never condemned free speech enjoyed by powerful interests. He sought only a freedom to challenge them. His stance on free speech is, in that respect, classically liberal." I think that understanding why Marx was something like a free speech absolutist, or why he was a viewpoint absolutist, meaning that he would never advocate for censorship on the basis of the character of the views expressed, might help us inch towards an understanding of what kind of new man Marx might have had in mind when he was struggling for socialism, or the kind of cultural politics that he might have supported. After 1890, the question for revolutionary socialists revolved around whether the existing economic forces would evolve into socialism or whether a revolutionary subject, either the party or the workers themselves, would have to intervene and create a revolutionary break. This split in Marxism arrived because the ideas that had supported the struggle up to that point, specifically the idea that there would be a terminal crisis within capitalist economics that would move the workers and the party both to revolution, appeared discredited after the Long Depression, and especially after the boom that succeeded it. Marx, writing from within the revolutionary struggles of the 19th century, struggles that mostly preceded Bernstein and Luxemburg, not only thought that the workers were already revolutionaries, but also that they were already fighting a revolution. The bourgeois revolution had already created conditions for its own transformation. It had already peopled the world with a class ready to assume the responsibility of revolution. After 1895, that assumption gave way, and the assumption of a revolution was lost as well. It now had to be fought over, to be reestablished. Further, along with the loss of the revolution, the socialists began the process of losing the revolutionaries as well. I think that one step that we can take in our effort to gain back both would be to embrace free speech. That is, rather than turning to the state, to the capitalists to do our ideological work for us, we should demand a different kind of safe space, a space wherein we are safe to think together. The history of our defeats is still weighing us down, even if much of that history has been forgotten or distorted. We are in no position to dictate what the culture should be, especially as the structure of the power that produces the current culture is contradictory and in crisis. Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.